The early morning sun painted golden streaks across the kitchen window as Priya stirred honey into her tea, watching her husband Raj pack his fishing gear. It was just another Tuesday in their seaside town of Pearl Bay, where the couple had built their life together over the past 8 years. Their small house, just a 10-minute walk from the harbor, was filled with photographs of their adventures and dreams yet to come true. "Don't forget to pick up those paint samples," Priya called out, smiling as Raj struggled with his waterproof jacket. They had been planning to transform their spare bedroom into a nursery. After years of focusing on their careers, Priya running their growing real estate agency and Raj managing his fishing business, they felt ready to start a family. "Got it on my list. Right after catch the biggest fish in the ocean," Raj joked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He crossed the kitchen and planted a quick kiss on her forehead. "I'll be back before sunset. We can look at those samples over dinner." The morning was unusually chilly for May, and dark clouds loomed on the horizon. Priya felt a strange tightness in her chest as she watched Raj's truck disappear down the winding road toward the harbor. She brushed it off as anxiety about their upcoming meeting with potential investors for the agency's expansion. Throughout the day, the weather took a turn for the worse. The wind picked up, whistling through the streets and rattling shop signs. By early afternoon, the local radio station issued storm warnings, advising all vessels to return to port immediately. Priya called Raj's satellite phone repeatedly, but the signal was weak, and her messages went unanswered. As evening approached, the Coastal Guard received distress signals from several boats caught in the unexpected storm. Priya rushed to the harbor, joining other worried families at the Coast Guard station. The rain pelted against the windows as they waited for any news about their loved ones. Hours stretched into days. Search and rescue teams combed the waters, finding pieces of wreckage from various vessels. On the fourth day, they discovered fragments of Raj's boat, Morning Star, floating among the debris. His orange life jacket washed up on a beach 20 miles north, torn and empty. The following weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and well-meaning visitors bringing casseroles Priya couldn't eat. Their cozy home, once filled with laughter and dreams, felt like a museum of memories she couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring herself to change. Nights were the hardest. She would find herself sitting in Raj's favorite armchair, clutching his old sweater that still smelled faintly of sea salt and his favorite cologne. The paint samples for the nursery remained untouched on the kitchen counter, a cruel reminder of future plans that would never materialize. The community rallied around her. Raj's crew members stopped by regularly, sharing stories about him that made her laugh through tears. Her sister flew in from across the country, helping her navigate the complicated process of having Raj legally declared missing at sea. The local newspaper ran a beautiful tribute to him, celebrating his contributions to the fishing industry and his reputation as one of the kindest boat captains in Pearl Bay. At 32, Priya found herself facing a reality she never imagined. The real estate agency, which they had built together from scratch, became both her anchor and her burden. Each morning, she forced herself to get up, get dressed, and face the world, even when her heart felt like it had been lost at sea with Raj. 1 month after the accident, while sorting through Raj's desk drawer, she found a small notebook. Inside, in his messy handwriting, were lists of baby names he liked, sketches for the nursery, and little notes about their future together. On the last page, he had written, "Remember to tell Priya about the surprise anniversary trip booking." The tears came then, not in the violent sobs of fresh grief, but in quiet streams of understanding that life would never be the same. As she watched the sun set over the ocean from their bedroom window, Priya realized that surviving this loss would be the hardest journey of her life, one she would have to navigate without her favorite captain by her side. The first snowfall of winter dusted Pearl Bay 6 months after Raj's disappearance. Priya stood at her office window, watching white flakes settle on the harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the morning light. The sight of empty dock space where the Morning Star used to moor still made her heart clench. Her phone buzzed with another message from Arun, Raj's best friend and business partner. "Meeting with Henderson Properties at 2, need backup." Priya smiled faintly. Arun had been her rock these past months, helping keep the real estate agency running when she could barely get out of bed. "I'll handle it," she typed back. Work had become her lifeline, a way to keep Raj's memory alive while staying connected to the world. Their shared dream of building the best real estate agency in Pearl Bay now rested solely on her shoulders. That afternoon, as she walked into the conference room, Priya caught her reflection in the glass door. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually well-pressed blazer showed wrinkles she hadn't noticed that morning. The simple gold chain Raj had given her on their first anniversary felt heavy against her collarbone. "Mrs. Kumar," Mr. Henderson began, "we've heard about your recent difficulties. Are you sure you can handle this development project alone?" The concern in his voice barely masked his doubt. Something stirred in Priya's chest, not the familiar ache of grief, but a flicker of determination. "Mr. Henderson," she replied, pulling out her tablet, "let me show you our latest market analysis. The beachfront properties we've developed have shown a 40% increase in value over the last quarter." 2 hours later, she had not only secured the Henderson contract, but also gained their commitment for future projects. As she packed up her files, her hands trembling slightly from leftover adrenaline, Arun appeared in the doorway. "That was impressive," he said, holding out a cup of her favorite chai tea. Raj would have been proud. The mention of his name didn't hurt quite as much as it used to. He would have probably done his victory dance right here in the office. Priya laughed softly, remembering how Raj used to celebrate every successful deal with his hilariously bad dancing. Later that evening, Priya found herself doing something she'd been avoiding for months, cooking Raj's favorite butter chicken. The familiar scents of garam masala and cardamom filled the kitchen, bringing back memories of countless dinner preparations together, Raj stealing tastes while she playfully swatted his hand away. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. She'd finally moved his clothes from the closet, donating most to the local shelter, but keeping a few special items: his favorite sweater, the suit from their wedding, the silly Christmas sweater he insisted on wearing every year. His fishing gear still hung in the garage, but she'd organized it neatly instead of leaving it exactly as he'd left it. Small changes were becoming easier. Last week, she'd repainted the living room, choosing a warm yellow that reminded her of sunny mornings. Raj's mother, who called every Sunday without fail, had approved of the change, saying, "Life needs fresh coats of paint sometimes, beta." Not everything was getting easier, though. Nights remained challenging, especially when storms rolled in from the sea. During one particularly bad night, she found herself driving to the harbor at 3 a.m., watching the waves crash against the seawall. A local fisherman, who'd known Raj since childhood, spotted her and brought her a thermos of hot coffee. "The sea takes, but it also teaches us how to flow with life's tides," he'd said, his weathered face kind in the dim light of dawn. Those words stuck with her, becoming a mantra of sorts. The real estate office was thriving under her leadership, though in a different way than before. Where Raj had been all about bold moves and big risks, Priya found herself developing a more measured approach. She started a program helping first-time homebuyers, remembering how excited she and Raj had been buying their first house together. 1 year after the accident, Priya stood at the harbor during the annual memorial service for lost fishermen. As she placed a wreath of white lilies on the water, watching it bob gently on the waves, she realized something had shifted inside her. The grief was still there, but it had transformed from a crushing weight into something she could carry. A bittersweet reminder of a love that had shaped her into who she was becoming. That night, she opened her laptop and began writing, something she hadn't done since college. Words flowed as she described her journey through loss and survival, not knowing that this private act of healing would eventually lead her down an unexpected path of connection with others who understood her pain all too well. 3 years could change so much, Priya thought as she watered the small herb garden on her balcony. The basil and mint plants, started from cuttings given by Raj's mother, had grown into fragrant bushes. Much like these plants, she too had slowly put down new roots in this changed life. The real estate agency had doubled in size, now occupying the entire second floor of the building. Priya had hired 2 young agents fresh out of college, remembering how Raj had given her a chance when she was just starting out. Teaching them the ins and outs of the business brought an unexpected joy to her days. Ms. Kumar called out Anita, one of the new agents, poking her head into Priya's office one spring morning. "The architect for the lighthouse renovation project is here for the meeting." Priya quickly checked her reflection in her phone screen, smoothing back a stray hair. These days, she found herself caring about such details again. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and she'd recently started wearing the bright colors she used to love, retiring the blacks and grays that had dominated her wardrobe after losing Raj. The architect turned out to be Rohan Mehra, a man with kind eyes and a gentle voice that put clients at ease immediately. As they discussed converting the old lighthouse into luxury apartments, Priya found herself enjoying the easy flow of their conversation. He understood her vision for preserving the building's historical character while making it livable for modern families. "My wife loved old buildings like this," Rohan mentioned during their site visit. "She passed away 5 years ago, but she would have been thrilled to see this project." The way he spoke about his late wife, with love rather than raw pain, gave Priya hope that grief could evolve into something gentle. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became longer than strictly necessary. They'd linger over coffee, discussing architecture, sharing stories about their pasts, and sometimes just enjoying comfortable silences. Rohan had a way of making her laugh that felt natural, not forced. One evening, as they walked along the beach after a particularly successful presentation to investors, Rohan stopped to pick up a perfectly formed shell. "You know," he said, handing it to her, "I used to think having a second chance at happiness was impossible. But life has its own plans." Priya turned the shell over in her hands, watching it catch the sunset's colors. "I still wear his ring," she admitted, touching the gold band on her chain. She'd moved it from her finger months ago, but couldn't quite let it go. "Of course you do," Rohan replied simply. "Love doesn't end, it just changes form." His understanding made her eyes well up, but for the first time, they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. Their first official date happened naturally, almost accidentally. After a late meeting, they found themselves sharing dinner at a small Italian restaurant. Priya ordered butter chicken pizza, making Rohan raise an eyebrow in amusement. Raj would have loved this fusion madness, she said, surprised by how easily his name now came to her lips. As spring turned to summer, Priya found herself looking forward to mornings again. She started taking longer routes to work, enjoying the way sunlight played on the water. Her sister noticed the change during their weekly video calls, commenting on how Priya's smile reached her eyes again. The lighthouse project progressed steadily, each visit to the site bringing new discoveries and shared moments. One afternoon, while reviewing plans in her office, Priya caught herself humming, something she hadn't done since Raj was alive. The realization didn't bring guilt as it once might have. During the Diwali celebrations that year, Priya invited Rohan to join her family's gathering. Watching him help her niece light sparklers, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the festival lights. Later, as they sat on her balcony watching fireworks paint the sky, Rohan reached for her hand. "Is this okay?" he asked softly. Priya looked at their intertwined fingers, thinking about how life's greatest surprises often come disguised as its deepest sorrows. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "This is more than okay." That night, after Rohan left, Priya sat in her herb garden under the stars. The mint plants Raj's mother had given her were flowering, their tiny blossoms barely visible in the moonlight. She touched her wedding ring, still hanging from its chain, and felt a profound sense of peace. Love, she was learning, had an infinite capacity to grow, making room for both memory and possibility. The lighthouse renovation was nearly complete when Rohan proposed. It happened on a quiet evening as they walked through the almost finished penthouse apartment, sunset streaming through the restored Victorian windows. He didn't get down on one knee or make a grand speech. Instead, he simply took her hand and asked, "Should we build our next chapter together?" Priya felt tears spring to her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. They stood there, holding each other as the sky turned purple over the ocean. Later that night, as she called her family to share the news, she felt a complex mix of joy and gentle sadness, like watercolors bleeding together. Planning the wedding brought unexpected challenges. Priya wanted to honor both her past and her future, something Rohan understood completely. They chose to have a small ceremony in the garden of their new home, a charming cottage halfway between the lighthouse and the harbor. "You know it would be nice," Rohan suggested one evening as they sorted through RSVPs. "We could set up a remembrance corner at the reception, for both Raj and Kavita." His suggestion to include his late wife alongside Raj in their celebration touched Priya deeply. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. Priya's sister helped her drape her mother's vintage silk sari, its deep burgundy fabric shimmering in the morning light. As she fastened her Mangal Sutra, her hands brushed against Raj's ring, which still hung from its chain. After a moment's thought, she gently removed the chain and placed it in a small jewelry box alongside a photo of Raj. "You'll always be part of my story," she whispered, placing the box in the remembrance corner they'd created. Next to it sat a beautiful portrait of Kavita, Rohan's first wife, surrounded by her favorite sunflowers. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Raj's parents attended, his mother crying happy tears as she blessed the couple. "Beta, you've given us another son to love," she told Priya, embracing Rohan. Their acceptance meant everything to both of them. Instead of traditional wedding gifts, they asked guests to contribute to a scholarship fund for children who'd lost parents at sea. It felt right to transform their personal story into something that could help others. Life settled into new patterns. Priya and Rohan moved into their cottage, blending their lives with careful attention to each other's past. His collection of architectural books found a home next to her real estate magazines. Her spice cabinet expanded to include his favorite South Indian blends. They created a home office where they often worked late into the night, sharing ideas and dreams. The real surprise came 6 months after their wedding. Priya had been feeling unusually tired, and a quick doctor's visit confirmed what she hadn't dared hope for. They were expecting a baby. When she told Rohan, he sat down heavily on their porch swing, happy tears rolling down his cheeks. That evening, they walked to the harbor, watching fishing boats return with their day's catch. "I never thought I'd have this again," Rohan admitted, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "A family, a future to plan for." "Life has strange ways of giving us second chances," Priya replied, thinking of how far she'd come from those dark days after losing Raj. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something that made her appreciate joy more deeply. As her pregnancy progressed, Priya found herself sharing stories about Raj with their unborn child. She told the baby about his infectious laugh, his terrible dancing, and his huge heart. Rohan would sometimes add stories about Kavita, her passion for teaching, her love of gardening, her terrible jokes. They decided to convert the lighthouse's ground floor into a community center, creating programs for grieving families and children. It felt like the perfect way to honor their past while building something new together. One morning, as they sat in their garden drinking chai, Priya felt the baby kick for the first time. Rohan's face lit up as he felt it too, and in that moment, she understood something profound about love. It wasn't a finite resource to be carefully rationed, but an endless well that could nourish both memory and hope. Their daughter arrived on a stormy night, her first cries mixing with the sound of waves crashing against the shore. They named her Kiran, meaning ray of light, because that's what she was, a bright beam cutting through the darkness of loss, illuminating the path to joy they'd found together. 7 years had passed since that stormy night. Priya adjusted 3-year-old Kiran's jacket as they walked along the beach, collecting shells for her preschool art project. The morning fog was just lifting, revealing the lighthouse where she'd first fallen in love with Rohan. Now it stood as a beacon of hope for many families, its community center helping people rebuild their lives after loss. "Mama, look," Kiran squealed, holding up a perfectly spiral-shaped shell. Her daughter's joy in simple discoveries never failed to warm Priya's heart. They were heading to the real estate office afterward. Tuesday was always their special morning together before Kiran's afternoon preschool session. The office had grown considerably. They'd recently expanded to the 3rd floor, and Priya was showing a premium beachfront property to potential buyers that morning. "Ready to be Mama's little assistant?" she asked Kiran, who nodded enthusiastically. Clients always melted when they saw her daughter's dimpled smile. As they approached the office, Anita rushed out to meet them. "The clients are early," she said, taking Kiran's hand. "I'll watch her while you handle the showing." Something in Anita's voice seemed off, but Priya chalked it up to the morning rush. The property was one of their finest listings, a restored Victorian with panoramic ocean views. As Priya unlocked the front door, she heard footsteps behind her. "Welcome to Pearl Bay's finest," she began, turning around. The words died in her throat. Standing before her was a face she'd seen countless times in her dreams, now weathered by sun and time, but unmistakably familiar. Rage. Her fingers lost their grip on the keys, which clattered to the wooden porch. "Priya," he said softly, his voice rougher than she remembered, but still carrying that gentle tone that had once been her home. He looked older, his black hair streaked with gray, his face lined with experiences she couldn't begin to imagine. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Priya grabbed the porch railing for support, her knees threatening to give way. "This isn't, you can't be," she whispered, her heart thundering in her chest. "It's really me," Raj said, keeping his distance as if afraid to frighten her. "I spent 7 years trying to find my way back to you." The story spilled out between them on that Victorian porch as the morning fog completely lifted. The storm had thrown him overboard, but he'd been picked up by a Chinese fishing vessel far off course. A head injury had left him with severe amnesia, unable to remember anything but fragments of his past. The crew had taken him to their small fishing village in a remote coastal area. There, a local family had taken him in while he slowly recovered his health and, piece by piece, his memories. "Your face was the first thing I clearly remembered," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "But I couldn't remember names, places, anything that could help me find my way back." Priya stood frozen, her professional clothes and polished appearance suddenly feeling like a costume. This was the moment she dreamed of countless times during that first terrible year, her husband, alive, returning to her. But now those dreams crashed against the reality of her present life. Rohan, Karan, the home they'd built together. As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a text from Rohan. "Hope the showing goes well. Kiran forgot her favorite stuffed elephant at home. I'll drop it at preschool later. Love you both." Raj noticed her wedding ring, different from the one she'd worn during their marriage. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a pain so deep it made Priya's heart ache. "You've rebuilt your life," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I mourned you," she whispered, tears falling freely now. "We all did. Your parents, our friends, we searched for so long." Before either could say more, they heard the patter of small feet on the porch steps. "Mama?" Kiran called out, having escaped Anita's watchful eye. She stopped short at the sight of the stranger, hiding slightly behind Priya's legs. Raj's eyes widened as he took in the little girl's features, so similar to Priya's own. The full weight of the years he'd lost seemed to crash down on him in that moment. This wasn't just about Priya having a new husband. She had created an entire life, one that had grown and flourished in his absence. "I should go," he said hoarsely, taking a step back. I needed you to know I didn't abandon you, that I never stopped trying to find my way back." "Wait," Priya called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "Please, there's so much." She couldn't find the words to express the tornado of emotions whirling inside her. As Raj turned back, their eyes met across the sun-drenched porch, 7 years of separate lives stretching between them like an endless sea. In that moment, they'd both realized that this wasn't an ending or a beginning. It was something entirely new, a chapter neither of them could have anticipated. News travels fast in small towns. By evening, all of Pearl Bay knew that Raj Kumar had returned from the dead. Priya sat in her office long after everyone had left, trying to gather her thoughts. Her phone kept buzzing with messages, but she couldn't bring herself to read them yet. The hardest call had been to Rohan. "Something's happened," she'd said, her voice shaking. "I need you to come to the office." When he arrived and found her sitting there with Raj, the color drained from his face. For a long moment, the three of them just looked at each other, the weight of their impossible situation filling the room. Kiran, too young to understand the tension, had broken it by asking for her snack. Rohan had taken her home, his eyes meeting Priya's with a mix of fear and trust that made her heart ache. "We'll figure this out," he'd whispered, squeezing her hand before leaving. Now, as the sun set over the harbor, Priya and Raj sat in her office, surrounded by the life she'd built in his absence. Photos on her desk showed moments he'd missed. Her wedding to Rohan, Karan's birth, family vacations, the lighthouse renovation celebration. "Your parents," Priya said softly, "they need to know." She'd called them earlier, but some news couldn't be delivered over the phone. They were driving down from the city, probably breaking every speed limit. "How are they?" Raj asked, his voice catching. Did they suffer much? Priya thought of those first terrible months, of Rage's mother's endless tears, his father's silent grief. We held each other up, she answered honestly. Your mom still calls me Beda. She loves Kiran like her own granddaughter. The sound of footsteps made them both turn. Rohan stood in the doorway, holding a thermos. I brought chai, he said quietly. I thought we all might need it. The simple gesture, so characteristic of his thoughtful nature, brought fresh tears to Priya's eyes. They sat together, these three people bound by love and loss, as Rohan poured chai into paper cups. The familiar aroma filled the office, grounding them in the present moment. I don't want to destroy your family, Raj said finally, looking at his hands. I came back hoping, but seeing you with Kiran today, seeing the life you've built. He trailed off, unable to continue. Rohan spoke up, his voice steady despite his obvious pain. You're her first husband, legally still her husband. If you want to. No, Raj interrupted. Legal papers don't capture what's in the heart. I lost my right to make claims when fate took me away. He looked at Priya. You found happiness again. I see it in your eyes, in the way you flourished. I won't take that from you. Before anyone could respond, the office door burst open. Raj's parents stood there, his mother letting out a cry that seemed to hold 7 years of grief and joy. What followed was a blur of tears, embraces, and broken questions. Later that night, Priya sat on her back porch, watching the stars emerge. Rohan had put Kiran to bed, reading her extra stories to make up for the day's confusion. He joined her outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. What happens now? He asked, the question they'd both been avoiding. Priya leaned into his warmth, thinking of the strange turns life could take. I don't know, she admitted, but I know I love you and Kiran more than anything. That hasn't changed. The next few weeks tested them all. Raj rented a small apartment near the harbor, slowly reconnecting with the community that had mourned him. People didn't know how to act around them. The woman with 2 husbands, one returned from the dead, one who had helped her rebuild her life. Kiran, with the simple wisdom of children, was the first to adjust. She'd taken to calling Raj uncle, picking up on the way adults introduced him. She loved his stories about the Chinese fishing village and would beg him to teach her the few Mandarin words he'd learned. The legal implications were complex. Their lawyer struggled to find precedents for their situation. But somehow, the paperwork seemed less important than the human elements they were all navigating. One evening, as Priya worked late at the office, she found Raj and Rohan deep in conversation at the harbor. They weren't friends. The situation was too complicated for that, but they'd found a way to coexist, bound by their shared love for her and Kiran. The community center at the lighthouse became an unexpected sanctuary. Raj started volunteering there, his experience of loss and return giving him a unique perspective to share with others who were grieving. Watching him help others heal helped Priya understand that sometimes love meant letting go of what you thought you wanted and accepting what life offered instead. 1 year after Raj's return, Pearl Bay had found a new normal. The morning sun sparkled on the ocean as Priya walked along the beach, remembering how differently her life had played out from anything she could have imagined. The lighthouse stood proud against the sky, its light still guiding ships home, much like how love had guided all of them through their stormy year. The community center was hosting a special event that day, its first anniversary celebration. Raj had thrown himself into running it, turning his own experience into a way to help others. His support group for people dealing with unexpected life changes had become particularly popular, drawing people from neighboring towns. Kiran, now 4, raced ahead of Priya on the beach, her dark curls bouncing in the wind. Uncle Raj, she called out, spotting him setting up chairs outside the lighthouse. He turned, his face lighting up at the sight of her. The path to their current arrangement hadn't been easy, but children had a way of simplifying complex situations. Ready for the big day? Priya asked, helping him arrange the chairs. Their interactions had evolved into a comfortable friendship, different from their past, but meaningful in its own way. They shared a history that couldn't be erased, but they'd found a way to honor it without being trapped by it. Almost, Raj replied, straightening a banner that read, Hope shines here. Did you hear about Mrs. Kapoor? She's finally ready to scatter her husband's ashes. She said our talks helped her find peace. Priya smiled, remembering her own journey through grief. "You've helped so many people this year," she said softly. "You turned your pain into purpose." Inside, Rohan was hanging photographs on the walls, a timeline of the center's first year. He'd designed the renovation to let in maximum natural light, creating a warm and welcoming space. The three of them had learned to work together, each bringing their own strengths to the center's mission. As guests began arriving for the celebration, Priya watched her unusual family interact. Raj's parents had brought homemade samosas, enough to feed the whole town. They'd found joy in having their son back, while also embracing their role as grandparents to Kiran. Love, they discovered, could expand in unexpected ways. The biggest surprise of the year had come 3 months ago when Raj met May, a marine biologist studying local fish populations. She'd lost her husband to illness years before, and something about their shared experience of loss and recovery drew them together. Today, she stood beside him, helping direct volunteers, her quiet strength complementing his gentle nature. "Remember when we thought this would destroy everything?" Rohan whispered to Priya, coming up behind her. She leaned back against him, watching Kiran show Mai her latest shell collection. The celebration began with Raj sharing the center's achievements, the support groups formed, the families helped, the connections made. As he spoke, Priya noticed how different he was from the man she'd married years ago. They had both grown, shaped by their experiences into different people who could appreciate their past without needing to relive it. Later, as the sun began to set, they all gathered on the beach. Kiran had insisted on a bonfire, and now she danced around it with other children, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Mai sat next to Raj, their hands quietly linked. The simple sight filled Priya with unexpected joy. "You know what I realized?" she said to Rohan as they watched the scene before them. "Love isn't just about holding on or letting go. Sometimes it's about letting it change into something new." The evening ended with a lantern release, something Kiran had been excited about for weeks. Each person wrote a message of hope on their lantern before releasing it into the darkening sky. Priya watched her daughter's face glow with wonder as the lights rose higher, creating a constellation of dreams and healing. Standing there, surrounded by the family she had lost and found and built, Priya felt a deep sense of peace. Their story hadn't followed any conventional path, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be. As the last lantern disappeared into the night sky, Kiran tapped on her hand. "Mama, can we do this every year?" "Yes, sweetheart," Priya replied, gathering her daughter close. "Some things are worth celebrating again and again." The lighthouse beam swept across the water, steady and sure. Like that beam, their love had found its way through the darkness, not by following the expected path, but by being brave enough to forge a new one. They had learned that sometimes the happy ending isn't what you originally hoped for, it's something braver, deeper, and more beautiful than you could have imagined.